AQA specification introduction. This is a short guide to what to expect from A-level, really. Right, well, everything in English language, whether you're analysing written texts, whether you're analysing speech, looking at websites, exploring language acquisition, language diversity, language change, discussing debates and issues around language use, or producing your own original writing or investigating some aspect of language, all of these have as their basis the language frameworks. So that's what we'll introduce first. Now, some of these words and ideas you may have encountered already at GCSE. Some are maybe new to you, but don't worry, we'll go through them all gradually. So we have phonology and prosodics, lexis, semantics, grammar and morphology, pragmatics, and graphology. So let's go into a bit more detail about what these actually mean. So phonology and prosodics then are how the sounds of language are produced and how we use intonation, speed and volume when we're speaking to give emphasis or meaning to particular bits. Lexis are the different word classes and how they can be grouped together in patterns, and a lot of this will be familiar from GCSE and maybe even Key Stage 2. Semantics then is about the meanings we put into language. How is it we can talk about things? How do words actually mean? And how do we actually get the meaning out of those words? Grammar and morphology are going to be about how the individual words are put together into larger units of speech, whether that speech be, spoken word or written word. Pragmatics is all about the contextual factors that might have an impact on the language that we use and what meanings we might make of that language. And finally, graphology then is the use of layout, space, images, colour, etc., and how these are used in text to help us understand the meanings of them. So this is the basic framework for how we investigate anything in English. Now, up in the top right-hand corner, I've done a little screen grab of that structure. And what's you're going to find in the top right-hand corner occasionally is a screen grab of what's gone before, just as a kind of refresher if you've forgotten where you got to. So the first issue I'm going to deal with then is phonology and prosodics. Now, any of the language levels in English are going to have their whole list of key terms, which it's worth starting to get to learn and remember now. Again, some of them are going to be familiar from GCSE, some are going to be brand new. And don't be afraid of terminology. Terminology is just a shortcut. It saves us a lot of time and effort when we're writing about language. Rather than writing out an endless description, we can use one word, a piece of terminology, and it says it succinctly and quickly. So some of the words that you're going to need to know then are phonology, phonetics, prosodics, the International Phonetic Alphabet, or IPA, heterophones, homophones, articulators, diphthongs, sound iconicity, consonants, assonants, sibilants, lexical onomatopoeia, non-lexical onomatopoeia, and phonological manipulation, minimal pairs, that's the language. Now have a look at this diagram of the head. What I'd like you to do is take your tongue and put it at the front of your top lip, and then slowly work the tongue backwards onto your teeth, back up behind the teeth, run your tongue along the top ridge of your mouth, go as far as you can. When you start gagging, that's the time to stop. Okay, now when we make consonant sounds, we're using different bits of the mouth, and these are what we call the articulators. So I'm just going to go through a kind of little diagram of what the articulators are. So first of all, we've got the lips, which we call labials. Then we have the teeth, which are used for making dental sounds. We have the alveolar ridge, it's coming up next. And we've got the hard palate, or the palatal sounds. Don't worry about this language for the moment, we'll get into this in more detail later on. And we've got the soft palate, the velar sounds. And then we've got the glottis, which is used for making glottal sounds. So that's a rough kind of map of the mouth and the articulators. Now, each of the groups of consonants have a particular name. So we have the place of articulation, and that's what we just went through. And then we have what's called the manner of articulation, how those sounds are actually made. So the first group is the plosives, and this is when some of the articulators come together, it stops the air, and then it's suddenly released. If you think of the word explosive, that's a sudden explosion of air, and this is kind of how these sounds are made. So we've got b, p, t, d, k, g. If you say those, you can hear how the air is actually being suddenly released. Then we have the fricative sounds, and this is where a couple of the articulators are positioned together and a small gap is left for air to escape. So if you say the sounds th, th, f, b, s, s, you can see some of the places are together and you can feel the air just coming through that small gap. Then we have the affricate sounds. So these are when the articulators come together and they're released with a bit of friction, similar to the fricative before. So these are sounds like ch and ch. And you'll notice by the side of each of these, I've indicated what articulators are being used. So with the ch sound, it's the hard palate. Then we have the nasals, and this is where the articulators stop the airflow and there's a release of air through the nose. So m, n, g. All of these are the nasal sounds, and in some accents, other consonants sound slightly nasal, but when we get onto language diversity, we'll discuss accents. Then we have the lateral, where the articulators come together and air is released over the side of the tongue. The only lateral that you need to remember is the letter L, that's the only one. And then we have the approximants, which are similar to all the other consonant sounds, but the articulators don't come together. So when you say w or r, you'll notice lips aren't together or teeth aren't together, they're apart. So that's the manner of articulation. So we have the places of articulation and the manner of articulation so far. Now, some of these sounds, when you're writing them in transcription, when you're transcribing speech, have special symbols, and we'll get to this again a little bit later on. Okay, so we've learned a little bit about how consonant sounds are made. But let's have a look at the vowel sounds and how those differ. Well, if consonants are about restriction and release of air, vowels, that's not an issue. It's not about restriction and release. It's more about where in the mouth the tongue is. And again, we'll get to that in a little bit more detail further on in the course. So 3 types of vowels then. You have your short vowels, you have long vowels, and you have diphthongs, where there are 2 sounds made, one after the other. And you'll see how that works in just a minute. So if you say the word sit out loud, you can see it's a short sound. Now seen, sit, seen. It's minimal difference, but you can hear there's slightly more length to the articulation in seen. And now if we say the word kite, can you hear there are 2 sounds like I, kites, I'd. Okay, and that's called a diphthong. So the vowels also have a set of symbols that are used when we're transcribing speech. And this diagram shows where in the mouth the tongue is sometimes, where it moves to, and the kind of pairings of the vowels, the short and long vowels, and where the diphthongs, which sounds they move between. This is quite complex, and don't worry about this. You have 2 years to get used to this. This is just a short introduction. So down this list then, we start off with the short vowels, I, E, A, O, and we start to move on to the longer ones, U, E, A, O, U, and then we move on to the diphthongs. So, as I say, that you can see the IPA symbols next to the sounds. What you could possibly do, if you wanted to, is record a sentence on your phone or do it live. Try and transcribe it using the phonetic alphabet. Look it up online. And to type it in, you can use the link below. This is a kind of keyboard simulation of the phonetic alphabet, which when you're doing transcriptions, you can make use of that. But again, all this will become a bit more obvious as time goes on. Okay, I'm going to be using this pointing finger symbol to occasionally answer a question that students often pose, is what's the point of this? Why are we doing this? What's the point? Well, if you know how the phonemes or the sounds are produced and the names of the places of articulation, how they're produced, and whether there's a vibration or not, which we call voicing, which again we'll get onto, all of this is really helpful when you need to describe things like the way children pronounce words when you're studying language acquisition. It's also useful for describing differences in accents. And when you look at World English, you can describe which sounds non-native speakers struggle with because the sound's not one that's used in their original native language. This symbol means I'm going to give you something that you can go and have a read of to expand on things further or develop your knowledge. So this one then is, it was a notes and queries question that was posed, which was why do non-English speakers sound strange to our ears when they speak English? And if you read the answers, you can see how that illustrates some of the points above about how non-native speakers have difficulty with certain English sounds because they're just not in that language. And the other useful article is a little chart which shows you at what stage children acquire the different sounds, and that'll become quite important when we look at language acquisition further down the line. Okay, the other thing that we might want to consider with prosodics is sound iconicity. So when writers or speakers use sound patterns in writing to mirror the actions that they're describing, and this is where you will be possibly on familiar territory from GCSE English, or certainly some of it. So there's consonants, assonants, sibilants, lexical onomatopoeia, and non-lexical onomatopoeia. So from GCSE, you should remember that consonants is the repetition of consonant sounds. Assonants are patterns of repeated vowel sounds that have a particular effect. Sibilants is the patterns of repeated fricatives, the s, z, f, v sounds. Lexical onomatopoeia is where the word almost mirrors the sound it's meant to represent. And non-lexical onomatopoeia describes non-words, words that don't really exist, but do signify a meaning. So when a child points at a police car and says, Nina, it's not called a Nina, it's the sound of a police car, and the word Nina doesn't really exist as a word. So that's what we call non-lexical onomatopoeia. And sound patterns are incredibly useful because they can make things memorable. For example, brand names like Fat Face. That makes use of sound iconicity. Very often you'll see newspaper headlines using consonants, a string of words that all start with the same letter because it makes it memorable or makes it stand out. Jokes might also make use of this sound iconicity, and we'll get into that again further down the line. Parents who these are. There's a reason for choosing this picture. And prosodics then. It ain't what you say, it's the way that you say it. So in prosodics, we're looking at things like pitch and intonation when we're speaking, the variation in volume or the amplitude, and the variation in the speed at which we're speaking, which we'll call the tempo. And pitch and intonation shifts, we can look at those and see what kind of emotions are being expressed. How's that being shown by change in pitch? How a rise in pitch on a question might signal we want agreement. It's a lovely day, isn't it? See how we go up at the end. So I want you to agree with how I feel about the day. Or sometimes how the pitch and intonation can tell us whether a comment being made is sarcastic or sincere. Amplitude is also to do with volume, and we can foreground certain words. For example, I don't believe it. And here, how the volume, that emphasizes the word believe. It's that notion of belief. And you probably do this in text messages through capitalization when you're speaking to people. And, excuse me, a variation in speed can also show emotion or emergency, or urgency rather, if it's fast tempo. Sometimes when we slow down, it can show a lack of certainty or a lack of commitment. Okay, hopefully, you had time for your lunch, breakfast, evening meal to go down, and that didn't frighten you too much. Here's the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, when he made his address to the nation on Monday. Okay, you can find a copy of this at this YouTube address. And here's a task for you if you want to start getting used to this. Watch Boris Johnson's speech and see if you can spot examples of sound iconicity or prosodics. His speech is an absolute goldmine for this, and that's the kind of thing that we might find ourselves doing in English language, taking a significant speech or an interview or a radio DJ presenting to an audience who's not there, a kind of imagined community or audience, and looking at the language features that they exhibit. So if you want something to do between now and September, that's your first task.